The small town of Eldridge had always been known for its eerie stillness, a quiet that seemed to whisper secrets through the rustling leaves of the ancient trees that lined its streets. This silence was never more palpable than during the rain, when the patter of droplets on old roofs played like a somber melody, drowning out the noise of the everyday. It was on one such rainy night that the series of events began which would forever alter the fabric of Eldridge. Maggie, a local librarian with a fascination for the town's cryptic past, was walking home from her late shift. The rain had started as a gentle drizzle but quickly morphed into a torrential downpour, forcing her to take refuge in the abandoned chapel on the outskirts of town. This chapel, with its broken stained glass windows and overgrown graveyard, was rumored to be cursed, the resting place of Father Aher, a preacher who had vanished under mysterious circumstances decades ago. As Maggie pushed open the heavy wooden door, the smell of damp earth and decayed wood enveloped her. She fumbled for her flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating rows of pews coated in layers of dust and cobwebs. Finding her way to a dry spot, she settled down, her breath visible in the cold air as the storm raged outside. Suddenly, a faint whisper echoed through the vast, empty space. Maggie froze, her heart pounding in her ears. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, as if beckoning her. Swallowing her fear, she stood and followed the sound, which seemed to be emanating from beneath the floor of the altar. As she approached, the ground beneath her gave way slightly, revealing a hidden trapdoor. With a mixture of dread and curiosity, she opened it, the rusty hinges groaning under the weight. A ladder led down into the darkness below. Steeling herself, Maggie descended. Below was a narrow corridor, its walls lined with ancient tomes and artifacts. At the far end, a dim light flickered. As she moved toward it, the whispers intensified, now accompanied by a cold draft that smelled faintly of incense and mold. The light originated from an old oil lamp that sat on a wooden table surrounded by stacks of parchment and strange, metallic objects. As Maggie examined the room, she found a journal with the name Aher embossed on the cover. Opening it, she discovered entries that spoke of gateways to other realms, of spirits that whispered secrets of the universe, and of a ritual that would open the eyes of any mortal daring enough to see the hidden truths of existence. Her hands trembled as she read, the implications of Father Aher's research dawning on her. Absorbed in the journal, Maggie failed to notice the shadow that crept along the walls of the cellar, growing denser and more defined. It was only when the temperature dropped further, her breath forming a thick mist in front of her, that she sensed the presence. She turned slowly, flashlight trembling in her hand, to face the darkness that had gathered behind her. There, in the shadows, two luminescent eyes stared back at her, unblinking and intense. The figure stepped forward, the details of its visage obscured by the dim light, yet its form unmistakably human. Maggie stepped back, her mind racing for a logical explanation. "Who are you?" Her voice was a whisper, barely audible over the sound of her own heartbeat. The figure did not respond but continued to advance, its movements slow and deliberate. Maggie felt the wall against her back, realizing she had nowhere to run. The room seemed to close in around her, the shadows stretching and twisting into grotesque shapes. She clutched Father Aher's journal to her chest, her only shield against the unknown. The figure halted just out of the light's reach, its eyes still fixed on her. Then, with a voice that resonated with an eerie, otherworldly quality, it spoke. "You hold the knowledge that was not meant for this world. The gateway must be closed." Before Maggie could respond, a sudden sound from above, the crashing of thunder or perhaps something else, distracted her. She glanced upward, and in that split second, the figure vanished, as if it had never been there at all. Trembling, Maggie rushed back to the ladder, climbing out of the cellar into the chapel. The storm had intensified, the wind howling like the cries of the damned. She knew she needed to get back to town, to safety, but her mind whirled with the night's terrifying discoveries. As she stepped outside, the rain beating relentlessly against her face, she realized that Eldridge held darker secrets than she had ever imagined. And now, with the knowledge of the gateway and the spirits that lingered on the threshold, she was inextricably tied to their fate. Each step towards her home was burdened with the weight of this newfound responsibility. The rain seemed to whisper forebodings, urging her to look back, but she dared not. Upon reaching her home, soaked to the bone and shivering not just from the cold, but also from the chilling events, Maggie locked the door behind her, leaning against it as if to shut out the night's horrors along with the storm. But the security of home could not erase the echoes of that voice, nor the unblinking eyes that seemed to burn their image into her very soul. She changed into dry clothes, made a cup of tea, and sat at her kitchen table, the journal open in front of her. The flicker of the candlelight made the shadows in her kitchen dance menacingly. With each page turn, she uncovered more about the ritual Father Aher had obsessed over, rituals meant to bridge worlds, penned with a fervor that bordered on madness. The entries ended abruptly, with a final, frantic scroll that warned of a shadow not bound by flesh. As the storm raged outside, Maggie felt the isolation of her small house more acutely than ever. Every creak and groan of the old structure sent her heart racing, her mind conjuring images of the shadowy figure from the chapel. She couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed her from that forsaken place. Compelled by a mix of fear and determination, Maggie decided she needed help. She called her friend, Tom, a local historian and skeptic of the supernatural, hoping his logical mind would provide a rational perspective to the night's events. After a brief, worried exchange, hearing the tremor in her voice, Tom agreed to come over, despite the late hour and terrible weather. While she waited for Tom, Maggie pored over the journal, trying to piece together the fragmented knowledge it contained. The wind's howling seemed to crescendo with each mention of the ritual, as if protesting against her delving deeper. When there was a sudden knock at the door, Maggie nearly jumped out of her skin. Tom entered, dripping wet and carrying an air of concerned skepticism. Maggie quickly briefed him on the evening's discoveries and her unnerving encounter. Tom listened intently, his brow furrowed, occasionally glancing at the journal as if it were a puzzle to be solved rather than a harbinger of dark truths. Together, they reviewed the text, Tom's skepticism clashing with Maggie's growing belief that something beyond their understanding was at play. As they discussed, the lights flickered, a gust of wind rattling the windows violently, as if angry fists demanded entry. It could just be the storm, Tom reasoned, noticing Maggie's glance towards the windows. Old houses like this, his rational explanation was cut off by a loud crash from the upstairs, sounding unmistakably like the shattering of glass. They froze, a mutual dread settling between them. That wasn't just the storm, Maggie whispered, her voice tinged with terror. With a hesitant nod, Tom rose from the table, motioning for Maggie to stay behind him. They ascended the stairs slowly, painfully aware of how loud each creak of the old wooden steps sounded in the otherwise oppressive silence of the house. At the top of the stairs, the hallway lay in darkness, the only light coming from the occasional flash of lightning that illuminated the hallway in stark, chilling flashes. Reaching the source of the noise, they found the window in the spare room had been broken, jagged pieces of glass laying scattered inside, as though something had smashed it from the outside. But the room was empty, no sign of any intruder or animal that could have caused the damage. As they stood there, trying to process the scene, the air grew inexplicably cold, their breath visible in ghostly puffs. Then, from down the hallway, a soft, melodic whisper drifted to their ears, a lullaby that seemed both beautiful and terrifying in its sadness. "It's here," Maggie breathed, her body tensed for flight. Tom, despite his skepticism, could not deny the fear that gripped him. The whispering grew louder, a sorrowful tune that seemed to seep into the very walls of the house. They backed away from the room, unable to take their eyes off the shadows that seemed to creep along the edges of their vision, gathering, deepening. As they reached the safety of the stairwell, the whispering abruptly stopped. Their house fell silent once more, as if holding its breath. Maggie and Tom stood on the landing, hearts pounding, unsure of their next move. "We need to leave," Tom finally said, the urgency clear in his voice. But as they turned to descend, a figure materialized at the bottom of the stairs, blocking their path, its eyes glowing with that same unnerving luminescence Maggie had seen in the chapel. The figure raised a hand, the gesture both stopping and beckoning. The air around it shimmered with a subtle distortion, as if heat were rising from its form, but the chill that emanated from it was unmistakable, sinking into their bones. "Do not fear," it spoke, its voice a melodic whisper that resonated in the hallway, yet each syllable dripped with an underlying menace. "You have awakened us, and now we must speak." Maggie, gripping the banister for support, found her voice, though it trembled. "What are you? What do you want from us?" The figure took a step up the staircase, each movement fluid, like dark water flowing against gravity. "We are the guardians of the threshold, the keepers of secrets not meant for your kind. The gateway has been disturbed, the balance must be restored." Tom, his skepticism crumbling in the face of the inexplicable, moved closer to Maggie, his eyes fixed on the figure. "How do we restore it? What do you need?" The figure paused, its glowing eyes seeming to pierce through them. "The knowledge must be sealed, the gateway closed. She who has read the words must unlearn them, or all shall suffer the consequences." Maggie swallowed hard, her mind racing. Unlearn the words? The very thought seemed impossible. How could she erase what she now knew? The secrets of the journal were etched into her mind, a haunting melody that she could no more forget than she could the figure before her. As if sensing her turmoil, the figure continued, "There is a ritual, one that requires sacrifice. Are you willing to pay the price for your transgression?" Before Maggie could respond, a sudden crash from the kitchen below jolted them. The figure turned its head sharply toward the sound, a flicker of irritation, or perhaps fear, crossing its otherwise impassive features. "This dwelling is no longer safe." "They are coming," it hissed, the last word a sibilant echo that filled the hallway. "Who is coming?" Tom demanded, but the figure had begun to dissolve into the air, its form becoming mist and shadow, retreating from the emerging threat. "We must leave now," Maggie said, pulling Tom toward the stairs. They descended quickly, avoiding the broken glass of the spare room window, their minds reeling with the night's revelations and the unknown dangers that seemed to multiply with every passing moment. Reaching the ground floor, they found the kitchen in disarray. Chairs were overturned, the table pushed aside, and the back door swung open, banging against the wall with each gust of wind. Rain poured in, the storm outside as relentless as the terror inside. "They've entered the house," Tom said, his voice edged with panic. He moved to close the door, but Maggie stopped him. "No, we might need a quick way out. Let's just move quietly and try to understand what's going on." They moved through the house, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, revealing more signs of intrusion. Upturned books, scattered papers, and a sense of hurried search pervaded each room. It was clear that whatever or whoever had entered was looking for something. As they cautiously stepped back into the living room, a sudden movement by the fireplace caught their eye. A shadow, darker than the surrounding darkness, shifted, its form vague and undulating. A cold draft accompanied its movement, and the faint sound of that mournful whispering filled the room once again. "They are here," Maggie whispered, her flashlight trembling in her hand as she aimed it towards the shadow. The light seemed to swallow the darkness, revealing nothing, yet the sense of presence was overwhelming. "What do they want?" Tom whispered back, his voice barely audible. "The journal, maybe. It's all about that book and what's inside it," Maggie responded, her mind racing for a solution. Just then, the whispering intensified, converging into a coherent voice that surrounded them. "The book, bring us the book." Maggie clutched the journal to her chest, a protective instinct mingled with dread. "We need to protect it," she said, more to herself than to Tom. Tom nodded, understanding the stakes. Let's find a place to hide it, at least until we can figure out what to do next. They decided to hide the journal in the attic, the least likely place anyone would search considering the disturbances had centered around the lower levels of the house. As they moved towards the staircase, the house seemed to groan under the weight of its secrets, the storm outside mirroring the chaos within. Reaching the attic, they stowed the journal behind a loose panel in the wall, covering their tracks as best they could. The rain pounded on the roof, a relentless drumming that seemed to echo their racing hearts. As they descended back to the lower floors, the reality of their situation set in. They were trapped in a house with entities they did not fully understand, driven by motives that were as shadowy as their forms. Each creak of the old house under the storm's fury now sounded like a warning, each flash of lightning illuminating more than just the physical darkness. It seemed to flash on the brink of unearthly secrets, lighting up corners of reality they had never intended to explore. Maggie and Tom regrouped in the living room, the dim light from the fireplace casting eerie shadows across their faces. They sat on the floor, backs against the couch, facing the room's entrances with their flashlights laid across their laps. Whatever is happening, it's centered around that journal and whatever it represents, Maggie murmured, her voice barely above the crackling of the fire. We unleashed something by opening it, something that's been waiting for a long time. Tom, his usual skepticism drowned under the tide of tonight's horrors, nodded. The figure mentioned a ritual, something about sealing the knowledge again. But it also said it requires a sacrifice. What kind of sacrifice? Maggie shook her head, her mind racing through the ritualistic details she had skimmed in the journal. I don't know. But it seemed like whatever we're dealing with, it's bound by some ancient rules. It can't just take what it wants, it needs us to give it, willingly or not. Their conversation was interrupted by a sudden gust of wind that swept through the room, the open windows banging in unison. The candles flickered violently, some snuffing out, plunging the room into semi-darkness. From the dark corners of the room, the whispers grew louder, a symphony of voices that seemed both alien and painfully familiar. They both turned their flashlights toward the windows, the beams cutting through the darkness only to reveal the relentless rain outside, but nothing more. Yet, the sense of an impending presence was undeniable. We should check the rest of the house, Tom suggested, standing up with his flashlight in hand. Make sure everything is secure, and maybe find out what these things are looking for, aside from the journal. Armed with their lights, they began a systematic check of each room. Their house creaked and moaned under the storm's assault, each door they opened seeming to protest with a chorus of eerie sounds. In the study, papers were strewn about, bookshelves searched, but nothing seemed missing aside from the journal they had already hidden. As they entered the dining room, Maggie stopped abruptly, her flashlight beam foiling on the far wall. The old wallpaper, usually peeling and benign, now bore an imprint, a shadowy figure, much like the one she had seen in the chapel, etched into the paper as if burned there by an unseen flame. Tom came up beside her, his light crossing over hers. What there? His words trailed off as he traced the outline of the figure, its arms raised, one finger pointing upwards. It's like a message, Maggie said, her voice hushed in reverence and fear. Or a marker. But pointing at what? Tom asked. He's been following the direction of the shadow's finger, which led up towards the ceiling. They moved the dining table and chairs aside, positioning a ladder under the pointed spot. Tom climbed, his flashlight secured in his teeth, and pushed up the ceiling panel where the shadow pointed. A rush of cold air greeted him as he peered into the dark cavity. Shining his light around, he saw it, an old, leather-bound book, much older and more worn than the journal from the chapel. As he reached for it, a sense of dread filled him, the air thick with the anticipation of the shadows that lingered just on the edge of light. Descending with the book, Tom's face was pale, his hands trembling slightly as he handed the tome to Maggie. This must be what they're looking for, he said, his voice steady despite his obvious fear. Maggie opened the book carefully, her hands trembling. The pages were old, the language arcane, filled with diagrams and symbols that whispered of old, forgotten powers and bindings. As they pored over the book, trying to decipher its contents under the flickering light of the remaining candles, the storm outside crescendoed, as if mirroring the intensity of their discovery. The whispers seemed to gather, concentrating around them, eager and hungry. Suddenly, the entire house shook, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to come from the very foundations. The floor beneath them trembled, the walls groaned, and for a moment, it felt as if the house itself might collapse under the weight of the hidden truths it harbored. "We need to figure out what this book says," Maggie said, her voice firm despite the chaos around them. "It's the key. It has to be." Tom nodded, his eyes fixed on the book as if it were a puzzle only he could solve. But as they delved deeper into the ancient text, the atmosphere around them grew increasingly oppressive. Each page turn seemed to draw the shadows closer, the whispers louder, until the words themselves seemed to pulse with a sinister life of their own. The book detailed rituals and ceremonies, some to protect, others to banish. It spoke of the threshold between worlds and the beings that dwell within them, entities neither alive nor dead, existing in the shadows cast by human existence. It became clear that what Father Aher had stumbled upon was far more ancient and dangerous than they had imagined. The book referred to a specific ritual that could close the breached gateway, but it required elements that chilled Maggie to the bone, elements of personal sacrifice and bindings tied to the caster's life essence. As Tom read aloud the passages, his voice grew hoarse, the words seeming to stick in his throat. "This ritual, it's not just about reciting incantations or drawing sigils, it's a binding contract with those things. Maggie, it's asking for a part of one's soul, a piece of your very being." Maggie's hands shook as she absorbed the gravity of what the book proposed. "But what choice do we have, Tom? If we don't do this, those things will never stop, the gateway will remain open, and who knows what else might come through." Tom closed the book, rubbing his temples as he pondered their dire situation. "I know, but Maggie, are you ready to pay such a price? Once we start this, there's no going back." Before Maggie could respond, a sudden, violent bang shook the door leading to the cellar. The sound was like a gunshot, echoing through the house, silencing the whispers and sending a stark wave of terror through them. The shadows seemed to draw back momentarily, as if the noise had startled them too. They approached the cellar door cautiously, flashlights piercing the darkness. The door was ajar, creaking softly as if inviting them to peer into the abyss below. Taking a deep breath, Maggie pushed the door open, the hinges groaning under the force. The cellar beyond was pitch black, the air cold and damp, smelling of earth and something faintly metallic. As their light scanned the room, they caught sight of something lying in the far corner, a figure, huddled and still. As they approached, the beam of Maggie's flashlight revealed it to be a man, his clothes torn, his body covered in mud and leaves as if he had been dragged through the woods. His face was turned away, making him unrecognizable. "Hello. Can you hear us?" Tom called out, his voice trembling slightly. The man stirred, coughing harshly, his body convulsing with the effort. Slowly, painfully, he turned his head toward them. The face that looked back was shockingly familiar. It was Mr. Dalton, the town's elderly librarian, a colleague and friend of Maggie's. "Mr. Dalton!" Maggie exclaimed, rushing to his side. "What happened to you?" His voice was weak, barely a whisper as he grasped Maggie's hand with surprising strength. They took me, tried to use me to open the gateway further. You must stop them." The book, his words trailed off as he coughed again, his body shaking. "But how did you escape?" Tom asked, looking around the cellar for any signs of another presence. I wasn't alone," Mr. Dalton murmured, his eyes flickering with fear. "There's another." "He's still down here." Before they could ask more, a low growl echoed through the cellar, a sound not human nor animal, but something in between. A new fear gripped Maggie and Tom as they realized that whatever had accompanied Mr. Dalton was still lurking in the shadows. Maggie tightened her grip on the flashlight, her other hand searching for anything she could use as a weapon. "Tom, we need to get him out of here. Now." They helped Mr. Dalton to his feet, supporting his weight between them as they moved back toward the stairs. But as they did, the growling grew louder, closer, until it was almost upon them. They quickened their pace, nearly dragging Mr. Dalton as they made for the safety of the upper floors. As they reached the bottom of the cellar stairs, a shadow detached itself from the darkness, its form large and looming, blocking their only path to safety. The air around it seemed to distort, the edges of its shape blurring as if it were not entirely present in their world. Maggie raised the flashlight, her hand steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. The light fell upon the creature, revealing a face that was a twisted mirror of human fear and agony, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. "We won't let you have him," Maggie said, her voice firm, commanding. The creature hissed, a sound that was both a snarl and a mockery of laughter, its form swelling as if drawing strength from the darkness itself. "He is already ours," it rasped, its voice a chilling blend of voices, old and young, male and female, all twisted into one spectral nightmare. Tom, clutching a broken piece of wood he'd picked up from the floor, stepped forward, positioning himself between the creature and Maggie. "Not while we're here," he declared, his voice echoing defiantly in the cramped cellar. The creature moved closer, the ground beneath it seeming to pulse and writhe with each step it took. The air grew colder, the breath turning to mist in front of them, and the smell of decay became overwhelming. Maggie, realizing they were outmatched but not willing to give up, whispered hurriedly to Tom, "The ritual in the book, it might be the only way to banish it. We need to distract it long enough to set it up." Tom nodded, understanding the gravity of what they were about to attempt. "I'll keep it busy. Get Mr. Dalton upstairs and start the preparations." With a deep breath, Maggie helped Mr. Dalton up the stairs, each step laborious and painful. Behind them, sounds of a struggle echoed as Tom confronted the creature, shouting and moving to draw its attention. Reaching the main floor, Maggie set Mr. Dalton on a couch, quickly gathering candles and chalk from a nearby drawer, items she remembered seeing outlined in the ritual. She drew a circle around them with the chalk, placing candles at specific points, her hands shaking but her resolve firm. Downstairs, Tom dodged and weaved around the creature's attacks. Each time it lunged, he was barely a step ahead, using his makeshift weapon to parry and keep it at bay. The creature's frustration grew, its form flickering erratically between solidity and shadow, a sign that it was bound to the physical plane only by the energy of the gateway. Maggie, working quickly, recited the words from the book, her voice steady and clear. The air within the circle shimmered, growing warmer, the candle's flames burning brighter and steadier. "By the boundaries set by earth and fire, I bind thee," she intoned, her voice echoing in the now silent house. "By the will of those who guard the threshold, I command thee, return to the darkness from whence you came." As she spoke the final words, a surge of energy filled the room, the circle glowing with a pure, fierce light. Downstairs, the creature gave a final, ear-splitting shriek, its form destabilizing rapidly as the ritual's power reached its peak. Tom, seizing the moment, pushed forward with all his strength, driving the creature back into the shadows from which it had emerged. As it crossed the threshold of the cellar, the light from upstairs enveloped it, pulling it screaming into the unknown. Exhausted, Tom stumbled upstairs, where Maggie and Mr. Dalton waited, the tension breaking as the house returned to normal, the oppressive presence gone. They collapsed around the circle, relief and fatigue washing over them in equal measure. In the days that followed, the town of Uldridge returned to its quiet normalcy, the storm clearing as suddenly as it had arrived. Maggie, Tom, and Mr. Dalton recovered from their ordeal, strengthened in their bond and vigilant against the hidden darkness they now knew lurked just beyond sight. The book was locked away, hidden under layers of mundane detail in the library where only Maggie would find it. They hoped it would never be needed again, the knowledge within too dangerous to tempt fate. But as life continued, each rainstorm brought a reminder of that night, a whisper of wind that sounded almost like a voice, a shadow from the corner of an eye that seemed just a bit too dark. Eldridge was marked, a quiet town with a secret, and while the gateway was closed, they knew the world was full of doors, waiting for the curious and the brave to find them. And so, with the rain tapping gently against the window panes, Maggie would often sit and watch, a book open in her lap, waiting for the next storm, ready to protect the thin veil that separated her world from the shadows, always watching, always waiting. In the quiet months that followed, Maggie found herself drawn deeper into her studies of the arcane and mystical, driven by a need to understand and perhaps foresee what might lurk beyond the visible world. Tom, ever the skeptic-turned-believer, joined her in her quest, his logical mind providing a balance to Maggie's more intuitive approach. Together, they fortified their knowledge, preparing for any future disturbances, though the town of Eldridge remained peaceful, almost unnervingly so. Mr. Dalton, having recovered from his ordeal, retired from his position at the library, leaving the responsibility of its ancient texts in Maggie's capable hands. He spent his days tending to his garden, but the shadows in his eyes told of nights haunted by memories of dark presences and the chilling touch of the otherworldly. As autumn gave way to winter, the first storm of the season rolled in with ominous clouds and chilling winds. The townspeople, now vaguely aware of the strangeness that seemed to hover at the edges of their sleepy town, stayed indoors, casting nervous glances at the swirling dark skies. Maggie, however, watched the storm with a sense of resolve, standing at her window with the ancient book by her side. The wind howled like the cries of lost souls as it whipped through the trees, bending them with its ferocious gusts. Rain lashed against the windows, blurring the world into a watery canvas. In the heart of the storm, a faint glow appeared on the horizon, pulsing gently like the beat of a heart. It was an eerie, unnatural light, one that had not been there before, casting long shadows that twisted and turned as if alive. Maggie knew that something was coming, something that the ritual had perhaps only held at bay but not defeated. She grabbed her coat and the book, calling Tom to join her. Together, they headed into the heart of the storm, driven by a duty that went beyond their own fears. At the chapel where it had all begun, the door swung open as if welcoming them back into its dark embrace. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and damp earth, the pews cast in ghostly silhouettes by the intermittent flashes of lightning. They set up candles around the perimeter of the room, each flame flickering wildly in the turbulent air, casting dancing shadows against the walls. Maggie opened the book to the ritual page, her voice steady as she began to recite the words that they hoped would seal the gateway forever. Tom joined in, his voice blending with hers, creating a powerful chant that filled the chapel with vibrating energy. As they spoke the final words, the ground beneath them trembled, and a sound like breaking glass pierced the air. The light from outside intensified, streaming into the chapel through the broken windows, coalescing into a figure at the altar. It was Father Hare, or the entity that had once been him, his features sorrowful yet serene. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm. "You have freed them, and me." With those words, the light enveloped him, and he vanished, leaving behind a calm that spread throughout the chapel. The storm abated, the clouds parting to reveal the clear, star-filled sky above. Maggie and Tom, exhausted yet relieved, watched as the dawn broke, the first light of day casting golden hues across the wet earth. The threat was gone, the gateway sealed by their combined will and courage. They had not only protected their town, but had also freed the souls trapped by ancient rituals gone awry. In the aftermath, Eldridge returned to its peaceful ways, but with a newfound respect for the legends whispered at night. Maggie continued her guardianship of the arcane knowledge, with Tom always by her side, both aware that the world was full of mysteries, some beautiful, some terrifying. But for now, the town slept peacefully, the chapel standing silent and watchful, a sentinel against the darkness, guarding the thin line between worlds. And in the library, the book lay closed, its secret safe, its power dormant, waiting for the next storm that might never come.